You're good. I can see it.
Perfect.
Okay, so somebody needs to nominate me as chair of the meeting.
I make a motion that we nominate Lisa Cody to be the chair of this meeting tonight.
Support.
Okay. So Supervisor Gunning is excused. Trustee Lannon is excused. Trustee Worley?
Here.
Trustee Melky?
Here.
Trustee Hauk?
Here.
Treasurer Rice?
Here.
And Cody is here. Oh, motion to approve the agenda.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
Support.
Okay. Trustee Melky?
Yes.
Trustee Worley?
Yes.
Trustee Hauk?
Yes.
Treasurer Rice?
Yes.
Clerk Cody, yes. Okay, now we will have a presentation for the cost of service study.
And if I may, just by way of introduction, the Township Board of Trustees back in January, I believe, entered into an arrangement with the firm UFS to conduct several studies for the township, all related to our water and wastewater operation. We have a cost of service study for the water operation, cost of service study for the wastewater operation. We did a miscellaneous fee review, a review of the various kind of ad hoc fees that we charge throughout the system. We also conducted a connection fee study review, and then we also began to look at the rate design. As we all know, townships use this concept we refer to as REU, residential equivalent units, and we asked the firm to take a look at that to see if that made sense or if there were any recommended changes in that area. So to conduct that study, the lead on that was Miss Dawn Lund. She's with us tonight. And so for the past 6 months or so, Dawn and staff from the township, through the exchange of data and various other communication, has essentially wrapped up that study, or at least I'd say 75% of it. There might still be a little bit of work to be done on the rate design phase of it, or at least in terms of more communication to the board. But tonight, last night you received 4 study reports. I'd call them executive summary level reports that are touching on all 4 of those aspects I mentioned. We do plan, we've been trying to hold off on having this so we can do it in person. It's can be a complicated subject and might lend itself better to in person, but we couldn't wait forever, so we are doing this tonight via Zoom. We are going to try to get together in person, maybe in September, to continue these discussions. The board members that are present: Dawn, Trustee Worley, Clerk Cody, who's chairing the meeting tonight, Trustee Melky, Treasurer Rice, and Trustee Hauk are all in attendance. We also have Mr. Phil Squatrito, who's the chair of our Planning Commission. And I thought I'd seen a member of our EDA. Mr. Rodney Nanny just joined us. Sherry Teals, the finance director. Mr. Nanny is our community development director. You have some other folks in the audience that I won't go over that are not on camera. And And so with that, Dawn, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here tonight on Zoom. I'm going to talk about some key targets, the studies that we conducted. I'm going to kind of walk through the reports for you. I'll pause and please jump in, if you have any questions. But just to give you a little bit of background, we conducted a water and wastewater cost of service study. Our cost of service studies basically roll 3 studies into one. I look first at a financial projection, looking at where you are today and where you're moving into the future for 5 years. I look at it with no rate adjustments, and then I look at certain key targets to help guide me on what your rate adjustment should be to keep the utilities healthy. So that's one study. After I define revenue requirements through that projection, I do what's called a cost of service study, where I take the revenue requirements and I allocate to the rate classes using certain cost drivers. So we get what's called the quote unquote perfect rate structure. What should we be charging by meter size? What should we be charging for our commodity? And I'm going to get into a little bit of that because that's a new type of concept for you. Now, you don't have to use the results as far as that rate structure. What you're getting tonight, if you decide not to change any rate structure, you still have the data you need to move forward over the next 5 years to keep the utility healthy. So the rate decisions, we're going to get into more detail in that on another night. I'm going to introduce that to you tonight. And the third part of this is that rate design. That's the art part of all this. I have to, if the board decides to change their rate structure from REUs to charging by meter size, that's not going to be a perfect transition. We're going to have some winners and losers there. Of course, we really attempt to minimize the impact to customers when we do that. And again, we're going to look more detail into that data later. I'm just going to introduce it. But one unique thing that you have is you also were granted a SAW grant in the wastewater department. And when we talk about the financial projection on the wastewater side, you're going to see how that SAW grant will influence that rate structure. In general, we're going to look at that rate track, and I'm meeting the EGLE requirements for that SAW grant. So you don't have to possibly, if you don't follow what you've agreed to follow for that SAW grant, as far as meeting any gap in a budget, you could potentially have to pay that grant back. So I think your decision in the wastewater area tonight is going to be a little easier, and I'm going to get there. I'm going to cover water first. And then of course, I'm going to go over the other fees, the other 2 reports. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to start with the water report. And you should all have this report in front of you. This is actually the water report, page 3. I'll kind of give you a minute to get there, or you can just follow along on the screen. But this, did we have any questions, or is that just some background noise there? Let me just see. I'm gonna mute all. If you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves. But for right now, I'm gonna mute everybody. So what you've got in front of you is a summarized table. Again, I've conducted that financial projection. There's about 100 spreadsheets that go behind this table. And there's 3 key targets I'm gonna talk about today. This initial table shows where you're moving in the water department without any rate changes. And the key targets that I'm going to talk about today are operating income, cash balance, and debt coverage ratio. I'm going to go through these in detail on water. It's the same methodology for wastewater, so I won't take the time to go through it again. The same methodology applies. But what operating income does is it ensures your current ratepayers are paying their fair share. In the perfect world, the system would see about a positive $500,000 operating income. Meaning if you take your revenues less your expenses, that operating income or that number left over would be about $500,000. You can see from the projection that the system is projected to operate at a loss. So again, if we're fully funding this target at $500,000, our current ratepayers are paying their fair share of the expenses in order to service them and the infrastructure being consumed. So it's an important target to meet in the long term. The second target here is this operating cash balance. I look at a minimum amount of cash I want the utility to hold unique to the water department. It's based on several factors. One is I look at your operating expenses and I want you to hold a certain amount of days working capital in order to fund those expenses. I look at the infrastructure you have sitting out there in case you have a main break, equipment failure, whatever it may be. I want you to have cash on hand in order to be able to get the system up and running again. I also look at your debt payment. I want you to be reserving 100% of your debt payment to ensure that you can always make that debt payment. I also look at your 5-year capital improvement program. And if you tell me you're going to spend $850,000 next year, I want you to have the funds available at the beginning of the construction year in order to implement that capital improvement program. So when I go through that process unique to the water department, I want the utility to hold pretty close to $1.4 million at a minimum. If we're approaching that minimum, that means we're considered cash critical and we need to do things to build cash back up something beyond that. Now cash is gonna build and decline mainly in coordination with your capital improvement program. When we're in a period of spending down funds and investing in capital, our cash balance is going to drop. When we're not spending so aggressively, our cash is going to build. So our cash will raise and lower mainly due to that capital improvement program. In the water department in particular, we've got a extraordinary improvement out here in 2024 that I am projecting to bond $3 million for. That's the Isabella, something to do with the Isabella water treatment or water tower. I'm sure Kim knows more about that and I can look at my notes a little better, but it has to do with the Isabella project. And the last target that I look at is that debt coverage ratio. Debt coverage ratio is a measurement of debt affordability. Am I cash flowing enough from operations in that year to pay my debt service payment? This 2.8 right here shows that in this year, 2021, you're projected to cash flow enough from operations to pay your debt service payment at least 2.81 times. We want that to be about a 1.45 at a minimum. So that's a healthy debt coverage ratio. That simply means you can afford the debt you have out on the system. Now you can see that debt coverage ratio greatly drops if we were to issue that bond in 2024, and we would need to correct that. And that's part of what I'm going to cover next is you can see that these targets, my operating income, I'm currently operating at a loss. The losses are projected to grow. My cash balance spends down over the 5-year period. And remember, this cash balance would go negative if I didn't have that bond in there. So what's keeping this cash balance positive is that $3 million bond for the extraordinary expenditure. And of course, my debt coverage ratio is healthy until I issue that bond in 2024. Before I move on, I'm going to give you guys a minute to unpause yourself in case you have a question, but I'll keep everybody muted, but you can just go ahead and individually click the little red microphone if you have any questions. I'm going to pause for a second. So I don't see anybody unmuting. So I am going to continue forward, and I'm going to give you opportunities to comment throughout the presentation. So I'm simply going to scroll down. I did talk about the targets, but in case you wanted to look particularly at the detail, this is the debt coverage ratio. Again, I'm meeting my debt, projected to meet my debt coverage ratio. It's a measurement of cash flow from operations in that year. It's a function of adding my net income, my non-cash depreciation expense, my interest expense. That gives me cash flow available for debt service payment. I divide that by my debt service payment, and that's how I get my debt coverage ratio. It's an important target to meet. It's just a measurement of debt affordability. The second thing, target that I talked about was that minimum cash reserve. Again, I calculate these risks unique to you. The items that I mentioned was that O&M expense. I want you to be able to fund your expenses. I want you to be able to fund any infrastructure, either main breaks, equipment failure, whatever. That would be your historical rate base. Of course, I want you to always have on reserve your debt service payment, so you're always able to make that payment. And I smooth out that 20-year capital improvement program. I want you to have the funds available at the beginning of the construction year in order to fund those improvements. So that's my cash balance, unique to the water department. Operating income, again, this target, if I'm fully funding this target, my current ratepayers are paying their fair share. They're paying for the expenses it takes to provide service to them, and they're paying for the infrastructure that's being consumed in order to provide service to them. The rate of return, you know, we're a municipal utility. Some of the questions I get is, well, we're a municipal utility, we're not supposed to make a profit. This is not a profit rate of return. It's a break-even rate of return for a municipal utility. It recoups two things. One is interest expense on debt. Since it's below the operating income line, we set rates on operating income. Interest expense is below the operating income line. So I want my rate of return to be able to recoup that interest expense. The second piece it recoups is the inflationary increase on the assets I have invested in the system. And what do I mean by that? Let's pretend we have one asset and it's $1 million asset and it has a 10-year useful life. When I go to replace that asset in 10 years, that asset's going to cost me $1.3 million or something more. So the $300,000 in my example is what I'm trying to recoup. So when I go to replace my assets in the future, I have the cash available to do it. So in this way, this rate of return is a break-even rate of return for a municipal utility. It recoups interest expense on debt and the inflationary increase on the assets I have invested in the system. This equates to about a 5% rate of return for the water utility, and I would expect that rate of return to be between 4 and 7%, so you're on the lower end. Again, it's a break-even rate of return, recouping interest expense on debt and the inflationary increase on the assets we have in the system. Before I kind of get down into how we need to, what I would recommend in order to work towards the financial targets that I talked about, what do we want to do to turn around this operating loss? What do we need to do to kind of stabilize this cash decrease? And what do I need to do in order to meet that debt coverage ratio in that year that I'm issuing that bond? Before I move on to what I would recommend, are there any questions? I'm going to give you a minute to unmute yourself in case you have any questions.
Yes, Dawn. This
Yes.
is Brian.
Hi, Brian.
On page 4, regarding the projected debt coverage ratios,
Yes.
on the second line of your sheet there, it talks about depreciation expense. You know, from a business perspective, I'm used to depreciating different equipment, assets at different rates based on IRS code, that type of stuff. But I'm assuming you probably do that based on life expectancy is what you're using, or can you explain that a little bit?
Sure, great question. So what depreciation expense is, it's actually a non-cash item that rolls into your overall operating and maintenance expense. And you have certain assets, and you're absolutely right, that are depreciated at different lives. Like a computer is depreciated a different life than a main, a water main. So I take that fixed asset listing that you guys have, and I look at your total overall depreciation, and I look at the audit as well to ensure that that matches up. But what depreciation is it's actually a non-cash flow item that's trying to recoup the infrastructure being consumed in that year. The reason I add it back in debt coverage ratio is because that depreciation expense is hitting that net operating, that net income line. So since it's a non-cash item, and I'm trying to measure the cash flow from operations available for debt service, I have to add that non-cash item back to net income in order to show my true cash that I'm cash flowing from operations. Since depreciation expense is kind of like a placeholder, I'm just trying to recoup the infrastructure being consumed in that year. Does that help answer that question?
It does, and to paraphrase, if I may, but you're basing the depreciation life cycle on the life cycle of the assets that were listed in the inventory then, right? So you say a main should last this long.
33 years, for example,
Right.
or 50
Yeah.
years, whatever it may be, correct?
Yep, no, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you for that question. I'm gonna pause a little bit longer and make sure there aren't any other questions.
Dawn, this is Mark. I have just two.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. Do the existing bond covenants right now require a particular debt coverage ratio?
Though I believe those are revenue bonds, and that would require a 1-to-5 debt coverage ratio at a minimum. And so when we're above that minimum, that's a good thing. If we get close to that 1-to-5, that means we're not as readily available to be able to afford that debt. You don't have very much debt out on the system. And so that debt coverage ratio is very healthy. So a 1-to-5 would be what you need to meet. For financial planning purposes, I want you to meet closer to a 1.45 cents. Water, especially the water utility, can be susceptible to cold, wet summers where your sales would decline. So I want you to meet something above that 1.25. And I've shot for a 1.45 at a minimum. And of course, you're meeting that except for 2025.
Right. And then when you were talking about your operating cash balance targets, you mentioned a component of that being a certain number of days of operating expenses. Is that something in the neighborhood of 90 days or something?
Great question. So your question's actually multi-layered. So the cash reserve policy right here has 4 components to it, all right? And the 12.3%, which has directly to do with O&M expense, 12.3% is actually 45 days. If you take 45 and divide it by 365 days in a year, you'll get 12.3%. So operating and maintenance expense, I'm holding 45 days for working capital. Your historical rate base, your system was under 60% depreciated, so I assess a 1%. That's a very low risk, 1%. I take your total historical investment, I reserve 1% of that for main breaks, equipment failure, whatever it may be. Your debt service payment here, I want you to reserve 100% of that debt service payment always. In your 5-year capital improvement program, I reserve 20% or 1/5 of your 5-year capital improvement program, less any bond proceeds. Remember, we had that extraordinary expense that we're going to bond for. So your question is a good one. I look at 4 different components that have 4 different percentages, but overall, when I come up with your policy overall, you're reserving pretty close to about 200 days cash on hand. And what for a highly rated bond utility, bond rating agencies, you like to see 200 days plus. At a minimum, we like utilities to hold at least 120 days minimum. And so Again, your question is a good one. Overall, we want you to work towards holding 200 days cash on hand, but the individual components have different varying days. Does that
Thank
make
you.
sense, Mark?
Yeah, thank you.
Great question.
Were
Any
you
other
done?
questions?
Were you done, Mark?
I am.
Just if I may follow up on our manager's question a little bit regarding the coverage ratio. And this is more of a general question. I think you indicated that we want to be about a 1.45 at a minimum is what your target is.
Correct.
And currently we're looking at next year being at 2.8.
Correct.
We're a relatively young utility. I mean, our water and sewer lines are relatively young as far as Michigan communities go. And as I listen to this, my gut tells me that typically if you're a young utility department, that you'd have a much lower debt to coverage ratio. Is that an accurate statement?
No, what actually, the higher the debt coverage ratio, it typically means the lower debt that you have out on the system. And so you've got $156,000 principal and interest payment for your asset balance of, let's go look at that real quick. For your total historical investment of 15 million, you currently have, actually I can look at how much outstanding you have, but if you assume you're about 50% depreciated, because I know you're under 60% because I assessed a 1 there. So if you have 15 million, you have $7.5 million potentially you would quote unquote borrow against. To have $156,000 debt payment against that, you have very, very low debt. I see utilities with 0 debt, and I see utilities totally maxed out. So you have debt currently, but it's very low. That's why your debt coverage ratio is so high. It's good to have a high debt coverage ratio. That means you don't have a lot of debt on the system and you can afford the debt you have.
Right. I guess I'm just a little surprised by that. I mean, I knew our enterprise funds regarding water and sewer were healthy, or at least appeared to be healthy. But I expected a little bit more debt ratio, right? Just because we're younger, it seemed to me like we've paid for a lot of this stuff already, in other words.
Correct.
Go, Kim.
But you have, and you have capital coming up that we need to prepare to pay for, and especially that extraordinary capital improvement. So actually you're leading me right into kind of that overall picture, and how do we turn the operating income that's deteriorating around, and of course that spend down on cash because of that capital improvement program. But before I go there, are there any other questions? You guys have great questions.
I just want to say I meant to lead you there. It was on purpose.
Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you. So we're going to go down to page, I don't know why my page down doesn't want to work. There we go. So we're going to go I'm still in the water report, obviously, page 9. And, you know, again, I talked about key targets: operating income, operating cash balance, and debt coverage ratio. And if you recall, the system was operating at losses and the losses were projected to grow. My cash balance from what it was currently today was projected to get to about a 1.4 million, and that was with a $3 million bond. So the goal here is to improve my operating income and not have those losses, to turn those losses around. But I'm trying to balance, I'm trying to balance that rate adjustment to not cause rate shock. Obviously, nobody likes a rate increase. But what I'm doing is I'm putting small incremental rate increases in at 4.9% each year to slowly work your operating income target to be positive. And you can see that I'm still not fully funding the system. If I were fully funding the system and my current ratepayers were paying their fair share of all the infrastructure being consumed and all the expenses it takes to service them, each year here would read about $500,000. You can see I'm not fully funding the system. But what I do is I look at the second target to try to balance that out. And I say, well, my cash balance was dropping. What can I do to stabilize that operating income, turn those losses to income and stabilize it, stabilize my operating cash balance, and create a minimum rate track for my ratepayers. I also, if you recall, in that 2025 year after that $3 million bond issuance, this dipped down to a 0.8. That means I wasn't even cash flowing enough from operations to pay my debt service payment one time. That's not a good place. We don't want to be there. So if we're projected to issue that bond, especially, we want to make sure we're turning these targets around and getting them healthy. So before I talk a little bit about rate structure, because right now you're currently charging by REUs, which is residential equivalent units. But before I kind of get into that rate structure, do you guys have any comments or questions on this rate track and what I'm trying to accomplish here?
Just one comment, Dawn. We've been wanting to do this study for a little while. In anticipation of that, we have not had a rate increase for, I want to say, 2 years. The township's been pretty good about increasing rates incrementally, but we did, this is for the board's benefit as much as anybody's. If you think 4.9% feels a little high, that's partly because we haven't had a rate increase in the last 2 years. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. So this is the water department, what I would recommend moving towards. Now, one of the decisions that you still have, the information you got from the study, regardless of whether you move to a different rate structure or not, you've got the information to move forward to turn the utility around, those operating losses around, and stabilize that cash balance. But right now, let's talk about how you currently charge your customers. You currently charge your customers $52 per quarter per REU. REU simply means residential equivalent unit. What happens is most households are a residential unit, so they would get a 1. But when you have something like a business or a car wash or a restaurant or whatever, you can envision that they would use something more than what a residence would use. So you actually refer to a table. It's a table created by engineers where you look up the equivalent of what that business should be, for example. So with the REUs, it is a system we see in Michigan and across the country, charging by REU. But sometimes those tables can fluctuate. For example, you could have restaurants that are similar restaurants that maybe have different REUs, or businesses that are similar that have different REUs, and there can be some questions that arise of that REU assignment. So what the industry does, a more standard industry rate structure, is to charge by meter size. And we charge a progressive charge by meter size. So everybody with a 5/8 inch meter, regardless of what they are, would pay a certain price for the customer charge. Everybody with a 1 inch meter would pay a certain charge. And the reason is the meter is what restricts the capacity flow to the customer. So no matter what type of customer has a 1 inch meter, if they have a 1 inch meter, they each have the same equivalent ability to put the same demand on the system as each other. So when you think of charging by meter size, it's putting everybody on the same basis. Everybody has the same ability in that same meter size to put the same draw or same demand on the system, and we're charging them accordingly. You take away some of that arbitrariness that can come with an REU assignment. Now, I'm not saying the REU schedules are arbitrary. I'm just saying you can see what seemingly seems some arbitrariness with those REU assignments. So industry standard is more to charge by meter size. The meter size, the cost gets progressively larger by meter size, which that's an AWWA manual. I looked that up in the manual. And it's, there's obviously more infrastructure, more expensive infrastructure that needs to be installed for an 8-inch meter compared to a 5/8 inch meter. The meter's more expensive for an 8-inch meter than a 5/8 inch meter, and so forth. So the structure, more industry standard is charged by meter size and to charge a commodity rate. Right now you charge by REU and a commodity rate as well. So one of the decisions that would come out of the cost of service study is, do you want to consider that rate change? And now's the time to do it. You could do it two ways. You could say, all right, we want to get this 4.9% right away, you know, with the budget, whatever you want to do. You could continue with that 4.9% rate increase, and we could look at more detail changing that rate structure in the next year. Or we could do it now. We've already done some preliminary work to look at how this rate structure would affect each of your customers. Again, it's sometimes not an easy transition. You're gonna have maybe 5% of the people that fall out of that bell curve. That could be winners or losers. And those are the more difficult ones in the transition to make sure we're keeping those customers satisfied with the rate change. So before I move on and kind of talk about how that would look, do you guys have any questions on either the 4.9% or how you're charging by REU, or what I mean by charging the more industry standard rate structure of meter size and commodity?
May I jump in?
Yeah, hi Brian.
Hi again. So on the REU, I just want your opinion. Some of the difficulties I've seemed to pick up with the REU is you have somebody apply, a new business, and they go through all the approvals for everything, and then the ship has to assign how many REUs that particular site or structure is going to use. And what happens or can happen, especially as the economy changes, you have businesses that may not be accounted for or listed in the REU schedule. And so then you bet you're doing your best guess at, oh, well, it's kind of like this, but it's also like that one over there. And you end up trying to guess and say, what's the best fit?
Exactly.
And so you've seen that too. So my assumption is, in looking at the meter size, that eliminates all of that confusion.
Absolutely. Yep, everybody with a 5/8 inch meter gets charged a certain charge, 3/4. It takes that potential arbitrariness out of the rates. And, REUs can get challenged. That can be an area that rates get challenged. And so it takes that away from that as well.
Yeah, there's potential litigation costs to the township in that light. And so can I follow up? And this may or may not be related to what you're talking about directly, but it's a question I hear a lot from residents. And my hope is that I better understand this through this process we're going through together. And that is where I have been to a resident's home, and they're one REU, but they don't use any water. It's a single person. They don't shower a lot. In other words, maybe they don't have great hygiene. I don't know, but they don't use their water. And their neighbor has 6 kids, and they wash all their cars, and they have a pool, and and they don't notice a big difference between their bills. And in some cases, in fact, as long as you're not going over the limit, you find that this family of 6 isn't actually getting billed any more than the single person home. And I hear a lot of complaints. How come I get charged the same as my neighbor? The neighbor with 6 kids loves it. But is it accurate to kind of say that what they're experiencing is this initial quarterly meter charge, but because they haven't exceeded any limits, there's no additional fees?
Yeah, correct. So that can be an issue as well. But when we set up that customer charge, I want you to understand what that's there for too, as well. You know, sometimes people misunderstand what that customer charge is. I'm not using much water, I shouldn't pay that. So let's
Right.
talk about what that covers. That covers things that don't change with usage, such as admin expense, meter reading, meters. It is a portion of the distribution system. So when we do a cost of service study, we do something called a minimum system analysis. And I look at the minimum infrastructure it would take to deliver 1,000 gallons to each of your customers. And that is the portion of the distribution system I can justify rolling into that customer charge. Because you have these customers, you would need to deliver at least 1,000 gallons to each of these customers. What type of minimum system would I need to build? Now, our customers demand more than 1,000 gallons a month. They usually, typically, our average customer uses about 6,000 gallons a month. So I build my infrastructure bigger than what it takes to deliver 1,000 gallons. So that I can justify more going to the commodity rate. So what the customer charge covers is the relative fixed costs in the system. The commodity charge covers the things like, okay, I've got a family of 5 that's using a lot of water, and I've got a household that just has 1 person that isn't using very much water. What we're trying to do, or what the average industry standard tries to do, is put the fixed cost recovery where it should be, the variable cost recovery where it should be. So that doesn't mean the customer charge, you know, some people question why they even pay that. They're paying for those things that don't change whether they use water or not, like those administration costs, a portion of the distribution system, and those things. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, 100%, and that's helpful talking points for me. So at some point, will we be discussing how we come to that variable between the fixed costs and the commodity costs?
Yep, and that's this chart here. I think I've planted you to get me to what I'm talking about next here. So all this is, this table that you see in front of you, there's more work to be done here. We've done a lot of work. Kim is amazing getting me the data I need. We've done a ton of work to look at each of your customers. And that's what we're working towards. You know, we wanted to introduce the concept tonight and then get into detail, a little bit more detail later. But what this would look like, this table here is the first year rate design. Because you may say, okay, look at this table here. How does it relate to the table up here on page 10? So these are, in the perfect world, the cost of service rates. We couldn't move to that in the first year. We have to move to this slowly, especially if we're changing our rate structure. So for example, when we take a 5/8 inch meter, I got to calculate this out real quick here. When we take a 5-inch meter, and I'm going to break this down monthly for you because I've got a monthly industry standard. But if we take the 42.55, we would charge a regular 5/8 inch meter about $14 a month. All right. The industry standard for that monthly customer charge to recoup the cost, the relative fixed cost of the system, the admin costs, those things that don't change with commodity, and a portion of that distribution system, I would expect that to be between probably $12 and $18 a month for a 5/8 inch meter. So your cost of service study falls right about $14. You're again on the lower end for those customer charges. So again, these are the cost of service study rates we have to work towards over time. I can't get there in the first rate design. If the board approves a 4.9%, the art part of all this is for me to take your current structure of the art, $52 per REU and $2.10 thereafter, and convert that to charging by meter size and a commodity rate with a 4.9% rate increase, and trying to do that as fairly as possible to everybody. Now, right now, what we've landed on is this rate structure. There are a few winners and losers, but we've worked for months to try to lessen those winners and losers and tweak this rate design to get everybody treated as fairly as possible that we can, moving to the new rate design. Now, once we move to a new rate design, if you choose to, the rate design after that is going to be much more simple and everybody's going to be affected more fairly. But you gotta think, okay, if I have a 1-inch meter here and my 1-inch meter was assigned a 1 REU, or I have a 1-inch meter that was assigned 4 REUs for some reason, my new rate design, of course, are going to affect those two people differently. I'm going to have some winners and I'm going to have some losers. And what we do is we scrub the data as much as we can to lessen that winner and loser effect and try to move to a more smooth rate design structure when we change it, if the board chooses to do that. So this is what our first initial go through would look like. $21.50 a quarter is $7.16 a month. Again, industry standards, I would expect that to be more like $12 to $18. And your first initial rate design is equivalent to $12.16 a month for the customer charge, and then they would be charged for all commodity used. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, my understanding is there's going to be no decisions tonight, but what I want you to know from everything that I've talked about so far, there are key standard financial targets that I look at to determine, is the system overall healthy? There are some things that the system are healthy, like not very much debt. However, we're currently projected to operate at a loss. Our cash balance is projected to spend down. We want to turn that around and stabilize those targets. We can stabilize those targets with a 4.9% rate increase each year for the next 5 years. The second decision, if the board chooses to do that, is I can take that 4.9% and then design rates to design a more industry standard rate structure where I'm charging by meter size. So it eliminates any arbitrariness that could come from charging similar customers different REU numbers, and a commodity rate. So that's what I have for water tonight. Are there any questions on water before I jump over wastewater? Now, wastewater is going to be much quicker. I've already talked about all the targets. It's the same exact methodologies for the targets, so I can go through that report much quicker. Are there any questions? Go ahead, Brian.
I'm sorry, I'm taking all your time.
No problem.
This is a general question based on some news I read today. And it looks like, Michigan a year ago basically tested all the municipal water systems for PFAS. And it looks like they're coming out with recommendations that may change the requirements for water systems if levels of PFAS and that may have an effect on capital improvement plans that we have to affect potentially right away. I'm assuming this study was done before that announcement today. You didn't do it all today, so it doesn't take that into account. But do you have a feeling for what kind of hit, based on what you know about our infrastructure, that may or may not have in our township?
Yep. So no, I don't. I'm not an engineer, and I did get your capital improvement program from you guys when the study started. However, you bring up such an important point that I have right in the report here. All this data is information we know today. This should be reviewed. In the perfect world, you'd be reviewing this annually with your budget process to ensure this rate track is on target. Now, sometimes I have municipals, clients that'll approve the first, second, or third year all together. If we overshoot or undershoot, I can correct that in the third and fourth year, no big deal. But what we don't want you to do is do this 4.9% this first year and don't look at this again for 5 years. This is a plan. If we don't continue to look at this as cost change, as capital change, these targets could go one way or the other. So your question's a good one. I don't believe there's any PFAS capital infrastructure in here. And that could change. You also have the lead and copper rule. If you find that you're needing more aggressive infrastructure replacement, this rate track could change. This is what we know today, and it's super important to be looking at this annually.
Great, thank you.
Good question.
Dawn,
Yes.
first on page 10, and I think you started to kind of talk about this. When I was first looking at this, I was kind of in my mind, the customer costs, I was kind of thinking, okay, in my nomenclature, that's the fixed cost component of a rate structure. And the commodity costs are the variable component of the rate structure. And you kind of alluded to that being correct, but I'm not sure for me that I am exactly correct. Well, because when I read the definitions, it seems like there is a fair amount of infrastructure in the commodity cost component.
Absolutely.
That sort of surprised me, and maybe it's just my layman sense of things.
No, you're totally correct. And that's why I say the relative fixed costs. And that's why we use that minimum system analysis, because what would happen is if we rolled 100% of the distribution infrastructure or the fixed cost in that customer charge, it would be a huge customer charge.
Right.
And that's when you would get the complaints from, your low income customer, your low use customer, whatever it may be. So what we try to do is we say, okay, what can we actually justify as a true fixed cost and put it in that customer charge? And that's that minimum system analysis, the minimum system we need to build to deliver 1,000 gallons to each of our customers. Now, that's in general, about 35 to 50% of the distribution system is rolled into that customer charge. That means there's about 50% or potentially more rolled into that commodity rate. So it's not a true one-for-one variable versus fixed. But what we try to do is balance that. It's best for the utility to have all those fixed costs rolled in that customer charge. That'd be perfect rate recovery and revenue recovery for the utility, periods of declining sales.
Right.
However, for the ratepayer, we try to balance that on a cost of service study, and make a justifiable portion go into that fixed monthly customer charge.
Okay, thank you for that. And then on page 13, and I get the transition, 2150 in year one for a 5/8 meter customer cost. What's the minimum and maximum on the table? What's that doing?
Good question. I in the perfect world, we wouldn't have that. Okay.
Right.
But when we looked at your data, I have to be careful with the REU assignments you have right now. If I don't establish some sort of minimum and maximum, we might not capture all the revenues we need to be capturing in the system. That's one of the things Kim and I really want to circle back and look at. I've put that in there right now to safeguard the revenues of the utility, to make it as fair as possible to your customers. In the perfect world, you wouldn't have that. But
How is it applied?
Pardon me?
How is it operationalized? How is it effectuated?
All I simply did is I looked at every single one of your customers and I tried to come up with a usage that what they're currently being charged now, we don't miss out on a lot of that revenue. It's a art to convert from REU over to meter size. Honestly, in that first year, that first rate design, you have to come up with something. And you're going to have winners and losers. And in order to cut back a lot on those winners and losers, I had to put a minimum and maximum in there. If I didn't do that, there were you know, hundreds of customers that fall out of my bell curve. Now I think Kim and I have this down to about 30 customers that fall out of that bell curve that we might need to still, you know, scrub their data a little bit better.
So is this saying that if we had already done this, I mean, if we implement this as it's written on this paper, that if I, as a user, my usage rate's going to be $2.50 for every gallon of water that I use up till 1,080,000?
So this is yearly usage here. I should have put a monthly or quarterly usage there so you can get a better idea of it. I just took some rows out of a spreadsheet where I took every single customer, I took their yearly data, and I applied this, and I said 60,000 gallons. So hold on, 60. So what you're really doing is you're taking 60,000 gallons, you're dividing it by 1,000. That gives me 1,000 gallons, which is the unit of measure you charge. So take 60,000 divided by 1,000, you get 60. Now divide that by 12. I'm trying to convert it to a monthly usage for you, which is five units. The average water customer uses about 6 units or 6,000 gallons. So when you convert this down and how you would charge, I'm saying the minimum customer usage is 5,000 gallons a month. I should have made this table more clear, and your question's a good one.
I see.
So I apologize, that's a yearly usage, but what I'm saying is I'm looking at about a 5 minimum per month, or 15,000. You currently charge that right now.
Right.
Right now you have a minimum of 15,000 per quarter,
Right.
and 5 times 3 is the 15. We get back to that 15.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So good question, and I can make that table more clear.
Can I follow up on that, please?
Sure.
So I thought I heard you say earlier something with regards, you know, the RUUs, the way we have them set up, we have that minimum, and it came out in that example of the single family home versus the 6-person home, that they have the same bill because they're paying that minimum usage fee. And I thought I heard you say that in going to meter size, that what you were recommending was all commodities get charged, meaning the way I took that was every gallon used is part of, in addition to their bill, but that's not what you're proposing here, correct?
No, that is what I'm proposing. So all gallons used would be charged $2.50. You don't get any free quote unquote gallons with the $21.50 per quarter.
See.
Right.
Now I see why you put, okay, this was more for informational but not part of the rate usage. How I'm not articulating this well. But it is accurate that all usage would be
charged.
and go, yes, okay.
Yeah.
I see that. Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. So it'd be $21.50 a quarter, or it was $7 per month. You know, I'm thinking monthly for you because
Plus,
and then all units used would be charged $2.50 on top of that customer charge.
right, which so on an average household of 5,000 gallons a
It's
month.
about 6,000 gallons, but
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, so maybe $15 a month in actual usage fees and a 5,000 or 6,000 gallon drawdown.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good questions. Sometimes you get so close to the data, the table makes sense to me, but you guys are asking good questions, and I can see where I need to maybe label that table a little bit more clearly. So thank you. So before I move on to wastewater, and I promise, I know you guys have had meetings. You had a meeting, you know, last night, and the wastewater report's going to go much faster. And then I'll get into the other 2 reports, the connection fee and the miscellaneous fees. Are there any questions on water? Okay, I'm gonna share my wastewater report here. You're gonna see it's set up in the exact same way. What's unique about the wastewater area is your decision may be much easier for you here. You were issued a SAW grant. I'm going to show you in a couple pages here, your budget did have a gap in the year that the SAW grant looked at the rate methodology. The rules are, if you have a gap in your budget in that first year, you have to meet 10% of the gap in the first year and the remaining gap in the next 4 years. It's part of the acceptance of the grant. That was part of the rules, if you will, to follow. So if you don't recoup that gap within a 5-year period, you know, there is of course potential to have to pay that grant back. Now, I'm not speaking for Eagle, I'm just telling you the rules of the rate methodology. So let's quickly review this. It's the same exact key targets I'm going to talk about: operating income, cash balance, debt coverage ratio. You can see that operating income, your wastewater utilities projected to operate at a loss. Our cash balance spends down significantly. Again, these targets that I want you to meet are unique to the wastewater department. The debt coverage ratio here, there's some debt that falls off in 2021. That's why this debt coverage ratio spikes. So if that looks a little odd, that's the reason. Of course, when I have debt fall off, I don't have as high as payment, so my ratio is going to go up. But how do I turn these losses around? It's the exact same concept we talked about on water. What do I need to do to turn those losses around and improve those targets? Well, your rate track was basically easy for me to set, quote unquote, in the wastewater department because I have to follow the Eagle SAW grant requirements. You've issued this report already a long time ago to Eagle for the rate methodology for your SAW grant. What the methodology showed was that you had a gap in your 2020 budget, and you have to recoup at least 10% of the gap in the first year and the remaining gap in the remaining 4 years. You can see I have a cumulative revenue gap here for you. We started with the full gap in each year with a 5.1% rate adjustment in each year. I just closed that gap in the 5th year by $9,629. So when we, and if you recall, one of the rules is you have to recoup 10% of the gap in the first year. This 5.1% recoups 18.3% of the gap, so we meet that requirement. The second requirement is that we close the gap within the remaining 4 years, and we meet that requirement as well. So that translates up into my table here. If I put those 5.1% rate increases here in wastewater, my adjusted operating income, of course, improves. I turn those losses around to income. My cash balance stabilizes and improves. And of course, my debt coverage ratio improves significantly, but that again is because some of my debt fell off there in 2022, by 2022. So in the wastewater department, you know, the decision becomes much easier on that rate track. If you want to meet the Eagle requirements because you accepted that grant, this is most likely what you'll have to be looking at. Are there any questions on this table or the gap, the SAW grant gap, before I move on to the rate structure? It's the exact same type of rate structure. You charge by REU. We're looking at charging by meter size to alleviate some of that arbitrariness that could happen with the REUs. Are there any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions. Again, when we look at, it's the same type of situation right now. You're charging $95.90 per quarter per REU, and you're currently, you don't have a designated commodity rate. Again, we would look at that customer charge by meter size. Remember, these are quarterly rates, and charging per 1,000 gallons for all gallons used. Again, there's winners and losers when you convert to this type of rate structure. We can get into that detail later, but we wanted the board to be thinking about this type of rate structure where we're charging a quarterly customer charge for the relative fixed cost of the system. And then we've got that usage charge. And again, I have a minimum and maximum here. And in the perfect world, we wouldn't have that, but I'm trying to lessen the impacts to our customers and stabilize the revenues of the utility in this rate structure conversion. So do you guys have any questions on wastewater? I mean, wastewater, it's a much, in my mind, easier rate decision making for you because you were lucky enough to receive a grant. And by accepting that grant, you basically have rules to follow. And this basically lays out those rules so you're meeting the requirements of the grant. Any questions on that? I don't see anybody with any questions on that. So I'm gonna jump over to I'm going to jump over to the connection fee report. Since we've been talking a lot about RUs, let's kind of keep along that line. The two reports that I'm going to talk about next have nothing to do with your regular rate schedules. You've got other fees that customers could potentially pay. So a new customer would pay a connection fee. That's what I'm going to talk about next. You also have other fees that customers can incur when the service is requested or required. And I'll talk about that next. But again, it's called just a general fee schedule, and it's not related to those regular rate schedules for service. So what this report that I'm talking about here, it's called a connection fee analysis. When you have a new customer connect to the system, all this fee is trying to do is put that new connection on the same equity basis as your current customers. So when we look at this table here, I'm starting with water. I've got a certain amount of net assets that are invested in the system. And I've got currently a net book value or remaining value in that of 9.2 million. I currently have cash balances, this is as of 2020, in the water area of 3.2 million. That cash balance is going to be different than my 2021 table, because remember those tables I showed you were at the end of 2021. Because I'm trying to make a connection fee with information I know exactly today. So I've got a current cash balance of 3.2 million. I add that together. My equity before the principal I owe out on this net book value is 12 million. I owe about 1.2 million on my net book value. So my system equity is about 11.2 in the water utility. I look at meter equivalents, not REUs, not residential unit equivalents, meter equivalents. So I look at how many 5/8 inch meters I have, how many 3/4, all the way up to 10-inch meters. And I use an AWWA standard conversion for meter equivalents. And the system currently has 4,615 5/8 inch meter equivalents. So I simply divide that out, and my connection fee would be $2,440 for a new customer that's connecting on the system. And the reason we charge this charge is you've got your current customers that have built the infrastructure, that have built up this cash balance, that have equity in the system. So I'm trying to put the new customer on the same equity basis as the current customers in the system. That's all this charge is trying to do. So again, your customers that are already connected to the system aren't paying this fee. This is new customers connecting to the system. This has nothing to do with your regular rate schedules. Do you guys have any questions on this before I cover wastewater? Hi, Brian.
Hi again.
Hi.
So I understand the, I think what you do with the meter equivalents and then doing the division to come up with the equity cost essentially per connection.
Yep.
Per equivalent connection. And so if I have 4,600, we'll just say there's 4,600 connections. I know that's not accurate, but equivalent connections. And
Yep.
if I added 500 new homes all at one, now if you did that division, that would lower that charge per meter equivalence. So is this something you would revisit on an annual basis where you say, hey, we've added 500 connections last year. The equivalence basis needs to be recalculated not only on how much we're dividing by here, but also the other math you did above it. Is this something you adjust on an annual basis using the same formula?
Yeah, so good question. I wouldn't adjust this on it. I don't think you can adjust this on an annual basis, but in general, you probably should do this every 3 to 5 years. Your example of, okay, we're connecting 500 homes, most likely we had to invest infrastructure to connect those 500 homes, so my cash balance is going to drop, and it will kind of, an immediate 1 year impact won't have a large swing. Over 3 to 5 years, it might.
Yeah, and I actually thought if I put 500 on, we need to invest, but I was trying to set up my question so I understood.
Yep, no, perfect. I totally get what you're saying, and it's a good question. Of course, I would love to update this for you every year, but in reality, you probably only need to do it every 3 to 5 years.
Okay, yeah, and we're probably not going to have 500, to be honest, that are going to join in a year. I mean, how many years have we had it? And we have 4,600 on this system, right?
Right.
So, but thank you.
Yep. No, good question. Just a quick comment. This probably doesn't mean much to you, but if there's anybody listening out there that on a financial basis, so what we would do is you might say, okay, but if I'm collecting this revenue, then aren't I double charging my customers when they pay my rates? What we do is we take a conservative amount of connection fees and offset your revenue requirements to set rates. So it's not double charging our customers. It's not a dollar one-for-one offset. It's a conservative offset, but we do offset from revenue requirements from the revenue we get from these connection fees. Okay, so wastewater, same exact concept. All I'm trying to do is put everybody on the same equity basis. I look at your net assets. I look at your cash balance. I look at your outstanding debt. I look at meter equivalents. And I come up with a charge per 5/8 inch meter equivalent ratio, which is the $3,500 here. Again, this is new connections. I'm trying to put everybody on the same equity basis. This does not affect your regular rate schedule rate payers. Any questions before I jump over to the miscellaneous fee schedule?
Dawn, I think I understand, well, I know I understand the equity basis. It is another way of saying it, or maybe it's too simplified, but this is the cost to buy into the system that somebody else has already constructed, that exists, that creates an opportunity for me to access municipal water and sewer services.
Yep. In general, that's a great way a second way to say it. Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
Dawn, real quick,
Yep.
and maybe this is something that you didn't intend to cover tonight and you would wait, but in general, when you look at RU versus meter size, different fee structures, do you find that for the most part that the equity that you talk about, that it's actually more equitable in one model versus another in practice?
So you're going to find somebody that would totally defend the RU system, and it's used in Michigan and it's used across the country for sure. I'm more of a fan of the meter size structure for both connection fees and regular rate charging, regular fees, because it takes the potential arbitrariness out of it. So, but when you ask, do I see one that is more, has more equity in the other, you're going to have, under the RU system, converting to anything like this, you have winners and losers. And that's what I'm trying to balance here. You're going to have somebody that connected that paid more of an RU fee than what they're going to pay under this new structure, and just the opposite. So there isn't one system on a revenue basis that's better than the other, in my opinion. And you're going to find somebody that tells you their opinion, the RU system is fair and equitable and isn't arbitrary. So you're going to find both sets of people out there. But in my opinion, I think the meter size system takes away that arbitrariness. I've seen the arbitrariness. I think you guys have actually personally seen some arbitrariness in your system, you know, and have dealt with that before. And again, the reason it takes the arbitrariness out of it is because the demand restriction is through that meter. Anybody that puts a 5/8 inch meter, whether they use 1,000 gallons or 10,000 gallons a month, have the same potential to put the same potential strain, if you will, strain or demand on the system through that meter. The restriction is the meter. So it's their choice whether they use it or not. So we try to set that 5/8 inch customer charge as appropriately as we can for the relative fixed costs. And then the variableness, the 5 family member versus the 1 familyness in general comes through that commodity rate. I think that was a lot of rambling for what you actually asked.
I think you did. So if what I'm discerning to a certain degree is the equity really comes down into the art you keep discussing.
Right. If you were to convert from RU to the meter size, the rate design is where we need to be sensitive to everybody that we can as much as we can. And it's the art part of all this, that conversion.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Good questions. Any
The-
more?
Yeah, I just want to clarify that the art comes in because of the transition. If we were
Correct.
building a system from scratch, you wouldn't have the art, and you'd be using a meter, you know, an equity method, a meter method, if I was involved in it, because of the arbitrariness of it.
And the REU tables themselves aren't arbitrary. They're, you know, again, you're going to find those are done by engineers. You're going to, there's engineers that can defend those tables. The arbitrariness comes in. You had a great example before of maybe somebody's not on that chart and we kind of make some guesses there. We have to get it close enough or whatever. There can be some arbitrariness in it. I'm not saying the tables in general are arbitrary, but you can find circumstances that they become arbitrary.
There's a
Any
reason
other-
why it's called the equity method.
So are there any other questions on this connection report before I go to the general fee report? Okay, I'm gonna click over to, let me just do a new share here. So this again is not your regular rate schedules that every ratepayer pays. These are only services that are requested and or required from potential customers. This fee schedule, my understanding is, hasn't been updated probably, you know, in years, and it's not very typical that utilities update these. This is one area that most utilities across the country kind of need to take a look and refresh these schedules. This just happens to be the time you're potentially refreshing yours. So you've got several fees here, and you have the current fees right here in this column. And there's calculations to the back of this report detailing the calculations. But you can envision, like for example, your turn on and turn off fee, you're charging $20 to do that. And you're sending out an employee that's using a truck, that's using equipment, that's using time, that's getting paid benefits, all sorts of things like that. And if you envision that it takes an hour or so to have that happen, you can see that the $20 probably is a little light on some of these fees. A final read fee. I mean, we're sending somebody out there to do a final read with a truck, time, benefits, materials for $15. So we conducted a cost of service study, basically I'm not gonna go through all the detail in the back here. Kim helped me gather this data, determine how much time it takes, what pay level the employees are and so forth that would typically do this work. That's all done in the background. But these are the fees that we came up with on a cost to serve basis. You can see some of them are significant changes. So what we've done here is we've proposed a 3-year phase-in plan where we kind of phase and work towards these fees over a 3-year period. Again, not everybody pays these fees. This is when the service is requested or when the service is required. So it's a 3-year phase-in we're proposing, and it's basically just updating those miscellaneous fees that are not on your regular rate paying fee schedule. Do you guys have any questions on this? Again, I'm not going to go through the calculations. They're in the back of your report in case you want to look at that detail. So I talked about a lot tonight. Let me just summarize everything really quickly and briefly. Water, in order to work to key financial targets, we're recommending a 4.9% rate adjustment. We're also recommending the utility consider moving to a rate structure by meter size and a commodity rate. Wastewater, it might be a little easier decision for you. You were granted a SAW grant. There are certain requirements under that SAW grant. We've come up with a rate plan to meet those requirements of the SAW grant on the rate methodology basis of 5.1% over the next 5 years. You'll meet all the requirements of the SAW grant, plus move your utility to a healthier position. Your connection fee report, you're currently charging by REU. We looked at a methodology to charge on a 5/8 inch meter equivalent basis. And of course, this fee schedule of fees, miscellaneous fees that needs a refresh. You can see some significant changes there, possibly considering in a 3-year phase-in on these rates. Do you guys have, I mean, that's all I have for you tonight. I know you're not making any decisions. I threw a lot of information at you. You've got 4 reports you can study, follow up with any questions. But before we wrap this up tonight, do you guys have any questions on any of the 4 reports I covered?
One last one.
Sure.
It's not necessarily on the reports, but we talk about winners and losers, and I get that. 4 communities that have gone through a change in model where that small percentage feels a shock, right? And I understand you're describing trying to minimize or mitigate the effects of under the bell curve of those outliers. What is the effect of that or remedy for some losers? Do they actually choose in the case litigation or moving their business? I mean, what's your experience with that?
So in general, I'm not an attorney, but from the things that I've seen, first of all, about 50% of the communities that consider moving to this rate structure abandon the plan because of the winners and losers. I'm just going to be up front and honest. I was up front and honest with Kim and Mark right in the beginning. All the data you got is still good as far as how to move into the future if you don't want to change your rate structure. But about 50% of the communities that want to change because they think it's a more fair and equitable way abandon the plan because of those winners and losers. What are the options for the winners and losers? In general, the thought is, and what I've seen happen in the past, is what you've charged before was the best information you had at that time. Moving to a different rate structure now, getting a cost of service study, possibly moving to a different rate structure, you may have more data readily available to you now. And so you might want to move to that slowly over time. That's the part where moving slowly over time and trying to take 200 customers that are greatly affected and whittle that down to 30 customers that are more affected is what we've been working on for months and trying to do. So That may not be information you want to hear, but again, about 50% of the people abandon the plan. I've got one community in particular that keeps coming back. They really want to convert, but they're struggling with that winner and loser aspect of this. So we've looked at it a couple times for them. So it's not a super easy transition. We try to minimize those impacts, and you may not have one other actually interesting thing, winners and losers, to kind of lessen maybe the fear of some of that is, quite frankly, you do a little bit of that now. What you do is you assess, and Kim might be able to explain this a little bit better, but you actually evaluate by usage and reassign REUs. So every year you guys look at a customer's usage and you reassign the usage. So maybe last year a customer had 10 REUs, let's just say. And let's just say their usage went way down, and now this year you're assigning them a 3 REU. You've already done that last December. And in fact, when I converted or was trying to develop the rate design to convert or potentially convert, I showed Kim, I said, wow, I mean, some of the ones that you converted over last December are exactly what I would have done under this new rate design. So, and I said, how many complaints or questions or whatever have you gotten from that? And I don't think you've gotten any. It's a practice you've always done. You tweak those REUs. So you kind of do that now already. You have winners and losers every year, quote unquote, by tweaking that REU. It's the fairest thing to do. You're trying to be fair by reassessing their usage. But last year they might have paid 10 REU. This year they might have paid 3 REU. And you just have better data available today. And that's the same philosophy in which this would fall under. You just have better data.
Thank you.
Good question.
I actually really enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
I was not excited about it, but I'm leaving thrilled.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I know you guys are busy and I've taken up a lot of your time already, and I try to keep this to an hour, and we're already an hour and a half because it's a lot of information to throw at you. So do you guys have any other questions?
I just want to say thank you, Dawn. It was a pleasure to work with you on the study.
Well, thank you, Kim. Yeah, likewise. I mean, it's great for me to work with somebody that can get me the data. And, you know, again, Kim, you've been awesome on this back and forth with this rate structure, and we've got some more to look at, but, you know, we'll see what the board decides. So thank you.
Thank you.
Just as we're starting to wrap up, I too want to thank Dawn and Kim. And just for the board's benefit, we will be talking more about particularly the rate design conversion. I'm anticipating sometime in September. And we will also have an opportunity to talk about this, I'll say amongst ourselves or amongst the board. You've had the report after you've had some time to digest it without getting into the whole transition piece of it. Between staff and the board, we'll be able to work through the rest of the report with you before September. So thank you, Dawn.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to say, Dawn, that I really appreciate the clarity that you provide on what is a very comprehensive and can be a complex type issue. So I really was taking it in as I did the last meeting as well. You just present really well and very thoroughly, and make it more understandable. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. So I'm sure you've got a lot to digest, and you've got those reports. You know, if you have any other questions, I'm sure Kim will be in contact with me for the next step. But I really appreciate all your time tonight. And if I don't see anybody unmuting or any other questions. So Kim, do you want me to end the meeting, or do I just need to stop sharing? Do you guys, it doesn't look like you have more business, but I want to make sure. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and then you guys can continue on with your business.
I think we have to adjourn the meeting. So if you want to just stop sharing your screen, then Lisa can take back over.
Perfect, perfect.
Okay, so now we're going to open public comment. This is the opportunity for comment only. Questions of the board will not be answered at this time. For specific answers to questions, please call Township Hall 989-772-4600. If you have any questions, raise the little blue hand on the side where it says raise hand under participants.
If you're on the phone, I think it's *9, I think.
I don't know what it is. Okay, closing public comment. Any final board comments? No. Then we need a motion to adjourn. Oh, Melky?
Quickly, I know we're all tired and everything, but Mark, I just want to make a comment about timing that, election season's here and you may have a completely new board come November. And this is quite an undertaking potentially for the township. And what I would hate to see happen is this board take it to a certain step, and then here's Mark stuck with a new board, having to start over at square zero again and go through this process. And not that I'm anticipating you to start completely over, but I want you to be aware that is potential for you, Mark.
I understand the nature of the beast, and my guess would be that much of this would be resolved during your budget approval process, budget
Okay.
recommendation, because the board, old, new, whatever, has to adopt a budget, and it has to approve rates, at least for a system. And,
Your feeling is we can get a good chunk of this work done then prior to the end of the budget process then.
as a practical matter, you could get it all done.
Okay, thank you.
Treasurer Rice?
I just wanted to say thank you for Dawn and all the staff that helped with this study and making it as easy to read as it is and understand. It took a lot of work, so thank you for those that put the work in.
Yes, thank you. And then anyone else? Okay, we need a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn. No one wants to support?
Support. Around for a while, what the heck?
Okay, all in favor, raise your hand. All right, everybody said yes.
Bye.
Very much.
Thank you,
We can
Don.
close now.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Have a good night.
Everyone.
Go ahead and end the meeting, Dawn. Thanks.
Yep, thanks.